They're in honor of consumerism. I bought these pants when I was 20 in a thrift store. I still love them. Thank you. Allie doesn't like them for some reason. And the elastic is shot, so I'm also wearing a belt from the 90s to keep them on. I hope they don't fall off. Okay. Good morning. I am here to talk to you about Sabbath as covenant. I really knew nothing about this, so it was delightful to read Rob's book. Who's been able to go to the meetings downstairs? Oh, a lot of you. Okay, cool. And it's been convicting, too, because I can easily lose my focus on spiritual formation. Just in case that's not in your lexicon, spiritual formation is the process of cultivating and growing in loving relationship with God, often involving practices like prayer and meditation. I'm going to say the word practice a lot today. I think I lose my focus on practices because one of my biggest flaws, I have very few flaws, but one of my biggest flaws is that I'm impatient. I'm like a kid who wants to play the violin and doesn't realize that you have to practice a little bit every day to play well. Not that I'm speaking from personal experience with a 5-year-old or anything like that. Anyway, Rob introduces Sabbath by pointing out the dialectic between the spirit of the practice, or the intentions and goals that we approach Sabbath with, and the structure of the practice, which is more like the commitment to it. Are you setting aside the time? Are you engaging it purposefully in a way that involves some ritual or even some sacrifice? Rob explains that while these two elements can compete with each other, both are needed. And he calls on Dresner, who says that the law part of Sabbath without the spirit part would create a harsh, legalistic day that is nothing more than a time of gloom and restriction. But likewise, the love element of Sabbath without the law would disintegrate, or as Dresner puts it, quote, it would have no substance, no reality, no pattern for expression, no protection, no guarantee of permanence, end quote. I wouldn't describe love without structure in quite those terms, but there's no denying the biblical mandate for the law aspect, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the balance of law and love can be tricky. Some of you may have gotten too much of the law side as a kid. Allie tells me that his main memory of Sundays was being locked in his room for the afternoon because his parents told him that it was the Sabbath and he had to rest. Meanwhile, I got love with little spirit and no structure. My family rarely went to church, but we had one Sunday tradition, and that was that my dad would make sourdough pancakes for lunch. This tradition became so precious that it's been portrayed in many of the home movies that I made with my siblings. My mom has a very particular way of clinking her fork against the plate, and we all have our own impersonation of that. The feeling of Sundays for me was restful and joyful, but it was not linked to anything spiritual per se. Now, I was and am a person who craves structure. In my first sermon draft, I wrote that there was a small part of me that wishes I lived in the type of society that would support the Jewish tradition of Sabbath at its most prescriptive and punitive. That's because when Rob listed some of the rules, including no kneading or baking bread, no slaughtering animals, and no hammering, I thought, I've got those ones down. And when Rob said no cutting of fingernails or writing 2 or more letters of the alphabet, I thought I could handle that. But more importantly, I think it would be super fun to have religious reasons to police Allie's behavior, because right now I have to use I statements, and that sometimes gets old. But then I remembered what else the text says, and it's not in the Exodus passage that was read today, but right after that it says, anyone who desecrates it, the Sabbath, is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. So on second thought, I think we can all agree that flagrantly unmoored moral liberalism is best. But I thought it was interesting to think about that Moses or the multiple authors laying down the oral histories of these Old Testament books agreed with Dresner, or vice versa, on the importance of the law, that without it, the Sabbath would have no reality, no guarantee of permanence, And when faced with the fact that people tend to forget about God, they decided that they shouldn't be allowed to forget about God. It happens to be the case, I think, that the Sabbath is central to the Bible's own rebalancing act with law and love. There is an account in Numbers of a man gathering wood on the Sabbath. Moses and Aaron, does everyone know this story? I had forgotten it. Some of you are nodding, some of you are shaking your heads. Moses and Aaron ask God what to do, and God says the man should be stoned to death by the community. Although this is narrative in form with God's physical voice ordering the death, I would see that as a theocratic society where faith, or at least order, is engineered through forced compliance. Jesus, living within that society, both heals on the Sabbath and speaks to the Pharisees about why this is not a challenge to Scripture, but a fulfillment of it. Jesus says we're supposed to do good on the Sabbath. We're supposed to set people free on the Sabbath. As you recall, he doesn't end up convincing the Pharisees. A lot of people, including the writers of South Park, like to imagine literal Jesus dropping into modern times and figuring out what he'd be saying to us. I don't think Jesus would be prescribing capital punishment, but in terms of Sabbath, I do imagine him going, like, what happened to you guys? Like, I don't see it anywhere. Exodus 31:13 says, "Be sure to keep my Sabbaths, because the Sabbath is a sign between me and you in every generation. So you will know that I am the Lord who makes you holy." That language evokes the rainbow as a covenant and sign of a particular relationship between God and us. But there's a crucial difference between the Sabbath and the rainbow. What's that difference? Yeah, Karen says we have more control. So the rainbow is God sort of, according to how he speaks about it in the Old Testament, God showing us that. The Sabbath doesn't exist if we don't do it ourselves. And the Sabbath is a practice, like foot washing or communion, that serves to remind us of who we are called to be. That reminder has deeper implications for us than some inherent valuation of rest, because literal God literally created and literally rested. Rob explains, quote, "Sabbath trains us to view one another fundamentally as relational beings who are invited into a covenant with God rather than as machines for production and wealth accumulation. The ethical challenge in this for us is to confront and reject cultural views and practices that treat people mainly in terms of how they contribute to economic gain. It's an ethical issue today, and it was an ethical issue back when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt." That was all Rob. I think the way we often phrase this in a peace and justice church is, it was an ethical issue back when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and it's an ethical issue today all around the world, especially in wealthy countries that identify as Christian but have learned to blame poverty on poor people rather than on rich people. I really resonated with this part of Rob's book. I don't always remember this covenant application of Sabbath theology, but it feels a lot more relevant than the "do this because I told you so" aspect that some of us got through church and subsequently rejected as too legalistic. Sabbath is not solely about rest, but about a deep understanding of human flourishing amidst God's generosity. It includes seeing others' humanity, embracing human limitations, restoring balance, and it's experiencing contentment with what we have in front of us. So there's three applications within this that Rob talks about. One is that people are not machines. So Walter Brueggemann writes, quote, "The Sabbath commandment is drawn into the Exodus narrative, for the God who rests is the God who emancipates from slavery, and consequently from the work system of Egypt and from the gods of Egypt, who require and legitimate that work system." So the Ten Commandments begins with God setting up a contrast between God's self and the gods of Egypt. Therefore, efficiency should never take precedence over people, and when economic systems pursue efficiency without other restraints, wealth accumulation and concentration create exploitative systems. Sabbath is the contrast to this for us today, an explicitly unproductive practice. The second application Rob talks about is that social stratification should be corrected, which Brett upheld so nicely for us, speaking about Sabbath in terms of others, that some of the practices around rest were designed to help people recover from economic hardship and inequality. And the third application Rob talked about is a theology of enough. So God tries to teach the Israelites about this when they're wandering in the desert. If you remember this part, that food's provided daily and the households were to gather only what they needed for the day, but if they gathered more, then it would spoil. There was one day where they could gather a little bit more, and that was on the 6th day, so that they could practice the Sabbath. And the idea is that our Sabbath practice can point us towards a spirit of contentment and gratitude. And this is a contrast to the accumulation mentality that capitalism creates, sustains, and benefits from. So now for the part that I've struggled with more. I feel that when we discover or remember this broader and deeper meaning, the structure of Sabbath as the thing we do on Sundays doesn't feel like enough. Like it feels like we put all this effort into realigning our attention and our energy to and to following best practices for economic justice. And then the world is just going to go on in its exploitative evil glory. It's also more personal than that. Like I recognize I benefit from and participate in exploitative practices, either because I'm ignorant about them or numbed to their seeming inevitability. Does it really matter if I refrain 1 out of every 7 days? My own experience of being an Israelite wandering in the desert, collecting manna every morning, is when I've gone trekking in the wilderness. Obviously, I am not skilled enough to do this on my own, but a few times I've gone on a week-long trekking trip with friends from college who know what they're doing. I was going to try not to mention this, especially if Carol made bingo cards, but she didn't, and so now I'm going to tell you that it was on one of these trips that I learned what super tasters are and decided that I was one. So we'll talk about being a super taster later. I can write the whole listserv about it. Don't worry, I'll cover it. When you're walking 10 to 15 miles a day through canyonlands or wherever, I know some of you guys do this too, you have to carry all your food with you, so it's inefficient to bring excess food. When I go trekking for a week, carrying only what I need for daily sustenance, having no internet access of any kind, with only my friends and the natural world to engage me, do I have an incredible, life-giving, transformative experience? Yes, I do. But when I get home, do I stop buying food for the freezer or spend less time on the internet? No, I do not. So I'm not saying that the trekking didn't do anything, but I feel like it's not enough, even as a challenging but wonderful experience, to change my factory settings, so to speak. Maybe I need more time. Maybe I need to do the Camino. Or maybe I'm as fragile and forgetful as the Israelites, because as soon as I come back to the real world, I begin to live by its terms again. It's not a critique of Sabbath. It's just my explanation for why the Sabbath desert journey didn't lead to lasting change for the Israelites, and why we have so many ongoing issues with economic justice today. I also couldn't resist applying this stuff to what seems like the new frontier of efficiency, artificial generalized intelligence. The promise of that form of AI is that we can finally have efficiency and rest at the same time. We won't have to give up on things we want for as cheap as we want them, because we'll just have AI do it. Round-the-clock labor, slave labor, that isn't abusive or torturous, because we're going to create intelligence that isn't sentient and is designed to want to serve us. Never mind the point that some of us don't think that real intelligence could ever be controlled long-term. What I have focused on as a mental health professional is what the AGI fantasy world reveals about how human beings understand and relate to human limitations. Human lawyers and house cleaners and drivers and writers need time off and money. As a consumer of these things, you might not be able to resist having them in their cheaper AGI forms. If you could talk to an AI doctor at 2 a.m. when you're worrying about the extremely rare but also fatal thing you might have eaten that day or been exposed to, or get your house designed by an AI architect who costs a fraction of a human one, you will be tempted very reasonably to choose the AI professional. I'm just pretending that this is going to happen. Whatever. This is a very complex topic that I'm covering way too quickly. My point is just that the further we go into the development of AGI, towards both the promises and the warnings about it, the more it becomes clear that our relationships to work, to rest, to efficiency, and to other people's work are matters of moral concern. Just in case I haven't been clear, AGI is not going to create a society where Sabbath rest becomes everyday rest for everyone. As per the authors Yudkowsky and Soares, if anyone builds it, everyone dies. I'm trying to get everyone to read that book. It's called If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. I'm glad the kids aren't in service this morning. But I've digressed, and actually where I land with all of this present and future uncertainty is that the Sabbath covenant and what it embraces still matters for us. It matters for our own spiritual growth and maturity, and it matters for the people and animals who get trampled by pure profit motives. I can't think of a better way to maintain our dedication to peace and justice throughout the week and for the rest of this excruciating administration's term than through practices that are rather simple and held in place by ritual and or community and or something with the heft and weight of law. If there's a special power to spiritual formation, like other than the Holy Spirit, which I do acknowledge, it's in the simplicity and the regularity of the practice. Especially when the powers of the world seem relentless and overwhelming, God's Sabbath covenant speaks to us, saying, keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you.